I remember when I first got started with web development, I watched a tutorial from Brad Traversy where he explained how to build a shopping list with the MERN stack. So that would be React and MongoDB and some other stuff. And when I finished that project, I had a moment of like, whoa, that is really cool. I just built that and the data is being persisted. So that is an actual shopping list we just built. And I want you to have a similar moment at the end of the video. So we'll be live coding the shopping list together. So I'm not gonna edit out the errors. So you can see how I go about error fixing, hopefully learn from that, because I think that's more valuable than having like a strictly laid out tutorial that goes through the steps without ever having any errors. I don't think that's real, because errors are a big part of web development, and that is in a good sense. So let's get started with the shopping list. I hope you enjoy the tutorial, and let's get right into setting up the database as the first step. Okay, now so to get started with a T3 stack, we want to create a new folder, call it something like, shopping list project, and then inside of that folder, we can open a PowerShell, npx create t3 app dot. The dot meaning don't initialize in a subfolder. And I'm guessing if you stumbled upon this video, then you probably already know this. We're gonna select everything except for next auth, initialize a new repo, and also run npm install. As always, I'm gonna leave the styling totally up to you. So CSS is luckily not gonna be a big part of this, and we're gonna be working with a planet scale database, so SQL. You can also follow along in like NoSQL like MongoDB, or if you want to ruin your day, you could also follow along in with Firebase, but I wouldn't recommend that because I don't really like Firebase. Yeah, so before we can get started, I'm actually gonna move the browser over here. Let's go to planet scale, and here you can see there is already a database because I already did this tutorial once, but it didn't go as smoothly as I hoped, so I'm doing it again. So let's delete this database right now and create a new one together, just so you can see what it looks like. Let's call it shopping list, create it in Frankfurt, create database, and when that's done creating, we can click connect, and you want to select the Prisma ORM to connect to this database, copy the string that planet scale gives you, and I'm gonna remove the database after the tutorial, obviously, so I don't have to blur out the username and password, because when this video goes live, these won't be working anymore, and just so you can follow along, a bit easier. All right, and the project has initialized. It should be right here. Let's open that up in VS Code. Let me move the code over here. Okay, and the first thing we're gonna do is remove the auth stuff. We don't need that for this project. Paste in the database connection string as an environment variable. And the reason we're doing that is so we can connect to the database from the, I don't know where it is, but schema.prisma. So if we go to this schema.prisma, one thing I always add is the preview features that you want referential integrity. We don't need it for this project specifically, but if you would like to expand on this project and use something like JSON values, then that will be helpful. And then for the database, we are gonna paste this in. So the provider is MySQL instead of what we had before, SQLite. The URL is gonna be the same, the database URL, and the referential integrity, not specifically for this project, but I just always paste it in because it doesn't hurt. And then let's get to modeling. So the shopping list we're gonna have will have certain items. So those items need a name. The name is gonna be a string. And also for later, because we want these items to be checked or unchecked, we're also gonna add a checked property. That is gonna be a Boolean, and we're just gonna need that for later. So once we have those set up, we can type npx prisma db push to push those changes up into our database. That's done. And then what I always do after doing that is open some Typescript file press Ctrl, Shift and P, and then restart the TypeScript server, just so the types will be available when we are working with the tRPC router. Okay, and once that has restarted, we can get started with the project. And for that, I'm just gonna delete all the main stuff from the index page. We don't need that, we don't need that. I'm gonna leave the head. Let's call it something like shopping list. Okay, and what we want for the shopping list is a main section. And then within that main section, we can have like an H2 that says my shopping list. Let's apply some styling to the main. That's going to be max with like 3XL, MX Auto. Let's give it a bit of spacing. And the my shopping list is going to be something like text 2XL and font semi-bold. Okay, let's spin up the server. I'm going to be using yarn. You can just type also npm run dev instead. That doesn't really matter. And then let's go to localhost 3000 and take a look. It says my shopping list. Okay, that's a start. So now we want to implement the functionality of adding an item, right? So how are we going to do that? Let's go back into the project. And then we want a button next to the heading, right? So we want a button right here on the right hand side. So let's wrap this in a div. That div is gonna be flex and justify between. There we go. And then we're gonna have a button that says add shopping item. Button is gonna be of type button. And what's gonna happen on click, we're gonna define that later. Let's just add a background of violet 500. Transition, a slightly darker background on hover. And well, it looks quite horrible, but that's not really, you know, the scope of this project. Rounded medium maybe. Looks a bit better. Okay, so we have an add shopping item. I'm just going to change the text to white. That might look a bit better. Okay. Now that we have that button, we want to configure our routers, which are essentially the same thing as the NextJS API routes, but in a type-safe way. And we are doing that with tRPC. If you don't know what tRPC is like the glue between the front and the back end. So you can just communicate in a type-safe way. And what that looks like in practice, you're gonna see right here in a second. And I've also made a video on tRPC. So if you want, you can take a look at that to get a bit of a better understanding, because tRPC is awesome for building these kinds of projects. So let's call it itemRouter.ts, and then const itemRouter is equal to create router. That's from context. So create router, it's the last function we're exporting from the context. And then as the first function, we're going to have the mutation, right? Because we want to create data in the database. And as I mentioned in the introductory video to tRPC and the T3 stack, we use the mutation every time we want to, you know, make a post request or a patch request, whatever. And the query, like the query right here, only if we want to make a GET request. So in this instance, we're going to use the mutation, and then let's call it like add item. That add item is passed a, you know, an object as the second property. The input is going to be just the name is fine. Let's just keep the name. And then we're going to have the resolve function, and we're going to work on this a little bit. But okay, so we have the basic stuff here. We still need to import Z from Zod, and Zod just allows us to type check the input that comes in. All right, so if you call this router from the front end, then it demands that you pass the name as well, or else it will error. Okay, but for now in the resolve function, we want to add an item to Prisma to our database. So how do we do that? So we can get the context as a second argument in the resolve. And then if you take a look at the context, you have Prisma on the context. And Prisma is the tool we use to work with our database. So we can just use that. So let's destructure the name from the, from the input. And then we remove that and await context.prisma. What it's called, item.create with the data of name, and that's pretty much it. Doesn't know that though. What did we call it? Oh, shopping item. Let's call it that. And now that we made a change in the schema.prisma, remember, restart the server. And also what I do is restart the Typescript server as well, so we can work with the types in the backend. So now it's not called item, but it should know the shopping item, but it doesn't. Prisma dot, no, it still has the example. So let's do that. Okay, why is it erroring? Let's just close that. npx prisma db push. Push that up to the database, clear the screen, start up the dev server again, and then restart the Typescript server again. And now, if everything goes well, it has the shopping item. Awesome. Let's continue with that. We are creating the shopping item with the data of name, and that's it. Still erroring though. Okay, because we forgot to create. Never mind. And then remember, because we also have the check property here, we are going to press Control Spacebar. That's gonna give the, that's gonna allow us to see the types that are expected, and checked will be initialized as false. We can also add the default of false right here, and then we could probably leave that out once we restarted the server again. npx prisma db push that up to the database, restart the dev server, and then restart the Typescript server. And now that error's gone. Perfect. Okay, we created the item. Now let's save that item as a constant and return the item from the router. So we are returning the shopping item, which has an ID, a name, and a checked value, and we can work with that on the front end. So let us implement that functionality. We can delete that. We can destructure later, and then tRPC, we don't want to query though. Use mutation. Remember mutation, because we have a mutation right here, because we want to make a post request to the server. And that mutation gets a string array. Pressing Control Spacebar should list the options that we have, but it doesn't, because we still need to implement the router right here. Can delete that. And we need to merge the item router with the big main router, and then that will allow us to press Control Spacebar right here, and then have items.addItem. And as a second parameter of that mutation, we can have the onSuccess handler, which will receive what we're returning right here, which is an item. Let's call it item. And then, as you can see right here, the item is a shopping item. All the types are already there. And then what we can do with that item is save it in a state, for example. That is called items. The type is shopping item array. We can import the type from the Prisma, which is very handy. It knows the type because it knows the model. And then we can initialize that as an empty array. When we get the item from the onSuccess, we are just pushing it to the state, which we can then render on the main page. So below all this thing, right? So let's render it below this div. within a UL. That's going to contain all the LIs. We don't want a button in here. That's not what we want. Then close the LI. And then close the whole map and the UL. So that won't do anything right now, but we can just pass it an array of orange and mango, for example. Remove the key for a second and remove that and just use the item just to see what it looks like. Okay, that looks all right. We're gonna keep that. Let's remove the array again, items to map. And now we don't have anything. Now we want a model to pop up when we click add shopping item. So let's implement that in a, we don't need that, in a separate folder. Let's call it components and use a item model.tsx. Inside this item model, we want a div that has the properties of absolute in set 0 and then bg, let's try black 75. And it's also going to be flex, justify center, item center. And then within that model, we're going to have another div. That div is going to have a padding of like, let's try 3. That div is going to have an h3 that says name of item. That h3 is going to be, let's try text, extra large, font medium. Space them out a bit. Let's have an input below that. And then it's already suggesting a button, which is good. We want 2 buttons though. It is suggesting those as well. Add. And we are missing something. The div. Okay. Now when we click that, nothing will happen because we haven't implemented the item model inside this component yet. Let's do that really quick. Oops. Just make it show up right here. And now we can actually conditionally render that item model. Let's call it the state that will control it. Model open is going to be Boolean and false by default. And whenever the model is open, so we're conditionally rendering this, then the item model will show up. Now what we need to do is make the button actually change that state. So let's set modal open to true from this button. And now the modal pops up, but it looks insanely ugly. Styling is not the point of this tutorial, but that just looks horrendous. Let's give the input a background of gray 200. That looks a bit better. And then the cancel and add button are gonna be, they're not gonna be flex, but a grid. So both take up 50%. And they are a bit too large for me, so let's give them like a padding of 1. Text small. Let's do text extra small. And yeah, that does look, it still looks really bad, but it looks a bit better. That's the font semibold. Okay, now name of item. Oh, and we need to space them out by a bit. Let's do gap 8. Okay, now what happens when we cancel? We're gonna close the modal, so we need to pass the method to close the modal through this. And we're gonna receive that inside of the modal. And that is of type dispatch set state action a Boolean value. And how do I know that? It's this type because when you hover over here, then you could just copy and paste this type pretty much, which is the same. But I've done this so often that I just know the types on top of my head. So when you press cancel, then we're gonna have an on click that sets modal open to false. And when we click add, then we want to call the router that lets us create an add item, right? And to do that, we can just we can worry about the destruction later, but we're going to import tRPC and then use mutation, right? Because this is a mutation. We're going to pass that a string array and of items add item. Okay, now the mutate is going to be, let's call it add item. And now when we click add, we want to add the item, like the text, whatever was typed in the input, as an actual item. And for that, we need to save whatever the user typed in state, right? So let's just call it input. It's going to be a string, and by default, it's going to be an empty string. Import the state. And then the input right here is going to be a controlled input. So the value is going to be input, and whenever we change the input, then we're going to save that in state right here, so we can add the item whenever we click the button right here. So on click, we're gonna add the item, and as you can see right here, when I press Control Spacebar, then the name is demanded because we put it as the input right here. We could also put like a description z.string, and then as you can see, when I press Control Spacebar, name and description are demanded here. So that's very handy in working with tRPC. For now, we just need the name, and the name is gonna be the input. Okay, so when we press the button, then it should add the whatever we typed in here, apple, to the database. And we can see if that is happening if we go to npx Prisma Studio. It's gonna open up our database studio. That open it up in Chrome, we don't want that. Localhost, and then it's 5555. We can see shopping item and one item right here, the apple we just added. Perfect. Okay, now adding an item should also close the modal. So let's just implement that really quick, like that, and then also close the modal. Now the next step would be to render out all the items we have on the front page, because that is not happening, right? We have an apple in the database, but not on the front page. So let's work on that. Let's go to the index page, and remember, we want to make a GET request now to get all the available shopping items. So let's call it get all items. So we're going to use a query as the second parameter. We're going to pass the resolve function. We're going to await Prisma find many, and then return all those items, the shopping items, back to the index page. Now, how do we receive them here? And by the way, we don't even need that here. How do we get the data here? We can just, I mean, GitHub Copilot is really good at this point. I don't even need to type much myself. It's items.getAllItems, because that's what we called this query. And now, if we don't have the data, which is called items data, we're going to implement some loading state now. Or if the function is loading, which we also get from the tRPC use query, we're going to return just, a P that says loading. This is where your professional spinner loader handling would go. But I'm just going to leave it as a P. And then whenever we have that items data, that's what we're going to map instead of the item states. And now, as you can see, we have an apple. Let's add a mango. Click add, reload the page. And now we have an apple and a mango. So that works perfectly. Now the thing is, we have to refresh the page for them to show up, right? Because if I add a PC and click add, the PC doesn't appear until I reload the page, and we don't want that. So how can we fix that? The answer is by having an item state, so what we already have, instead of, mapping the real items, and then pushing to that state whenever we are adding an item. So where are we adding an item? Right here. And so whenever this query succeeds, on success, we don't need those, and let's call it shopping item. Whenever this query succeeds, then we also want the set item state in here. So we can add to this state and then render that state. And that will basically not make us reload the page, which is very helpful. And we also need the set items here. It's gonna be the same type, so we're dispatching the same thing, but for the shopping item array. Now it expects the set items, and that's just gonna be equal to the set items. And now in this onSuccess handler, we can set items to whatever the previous value was, and then just push the array, just push a value into the array. And as you can see now, when we add something like a window cleaner, we press add, and it does not work. Probably because we are not mapping the items, but we're mapping the data coming from tRPC. And now it's just showing the window cleaner. So why is it doing that? Because we are not initializing the state correctly. So whenever we execute the query, because right now we wouldn't be using the state at all, except for the loader handler, we also want to initialize the state. So whenever the query is done, it's going to set the Apple, Mango, and PC to the state. And then when we make changes later, then they are just going to get pushed into that state, forcing the UI to update. And now everything shows up. And when we add an item like a camera, then it will immediately be right there. Okay, now the next step would be to implement deletion of items. And how do we go about that? First off, we would obviously want a button in the UI to indicate that, the user can delete the item. And for that, we're gonna install a library called React-Icons, which is just gonna make things a bit easier. And then import an icon called hiX from React-icon/hi. That icon, we can just, let's put it right here. Oops, we need to wrap that, and then we have the justify between already, so that adds those things to the very right. Let's also add a class name of text, large, and text red 500, so they just stick out a bit more. And whenever we click those, we want to delete the item. So for that, we also need another mutation method, and let's call that delete item. That delete item is going to expect an ID. So which ID are we going to delete? And then we can just close that off. Now the ID would be a string. Oops, string, not a number. That's why it was throwing an error, because, we defined the ID as a string, but if we expect a number, that doesn't make any sense, but we expect a string anyways. So okay, so if you want to delete an item, then we would not define that in the modal, because that's only where we add items. Okay, now for this part, let's destructure, but worry about that later, and use trpc.useMutation, because remember, we're working with a mutation right here. That mutation receives, as always, a string array of items.deleteItem, and we can destructure the mutate and call it something like delete item. Now the onSuccess lender gets passed in the object as a second property. We get back the ID and then remove that ID from the state of items that we have. Now, why is that throwing an error? The item is a shopping item.id, but we're also getting a shopping item back here, and that should be shopping item.id. Okay, if they're the same, then we'll remove them from the state. Now, when do we want to delete an item? When this li is pressed, and we can destructure the ID. So let's return the rest, but get the ID from item. So whenever we click, oh, we can replace this, by the way, and we can also destructure the name, put the name here. And whenever we click this, so the -x on click is gonna delete the item. And if I press Control Spacebar, you can see what the router right here expects. It expects an ID that is a string, and we are providing it with an ID that is a string from right here. Okay, now the item gets deleted from the database. Whenever that is done, the item gets removed from the state, and therefore the item gets removed from the UI. So let's try that, remove the, oh, and we probably want a cursor pointer. Let's try to remove the camera, and that removed the camera. Okay, so the removing is working just as expected. Really, really nice. Now the last step for this project would be to add the Strikethrough. That is also a pretty simple feature, but we don't want to just keep that Strikethrough in state, but also maintain it. So when you strike this item, when you click it, so you ticked it off the list pretty much, then if you reload the page, it should still be, it should still be Strikethrough. That means we have to interact with the database, and that means, as you know by now, that we need another mutation because we'll be making a post request. Let's call it check item. Check item is gonna receive an object, an ID, because we want the ID, we need the ID of the item we want to check. And then we are, let's see what GitHub, yeah, that's okay, that's really good. Now the check item, do we need this property? Yes, we do. Let's keep the property for now. Let's save that and implement the functionality on the main page. Again, let's worry about the destructuring later. It's going to be trpc.use mutation, pass that mutation a string array, and call it check item as the second parameter. We're going to have the on success, but we're going to handle that later as well. Let's call it check item. Okay, and when do we want this check item to happen? When we click the li, the corresponding li. So let's give it a background red of 500 just to see where exactly it is. And why is there such a margin on the right side of the li? Is that the same thing? Oh, no, okay. That is because the X is also there. So what we can do is wrap this in a div. Actually, no, let's not wrap this in a div. Let's just remove this and highlight the span with a background red of 500, and that should only be the text. Perfect. Now this is gonna be with full. We don't want the X to be on the left hand side, and we can also just decrease. Wait, that's supposed to be a maximum width of 3XL. However, it is way larger. Okay, but we will worry about that later. Let's just focus on the important functionalities for now. So whenever you click this span, then you would want something to happen, which is the, oops, what did I do now? Oh, okay, so Jesus Christ, what is happening? So we want the on click to happen, and that will check the item, and when I press Control Spacebar, it needs the ID, and it needs the checked property as a secondary. Now we will do the same thing we did with the items and keep the checked ones in a state. So the UI updates, checked items, we'll call it, it's gonna be a shopping item array as well. Let's initialize that as an empty array. Okay, now that we have the checked items, I actually want to rename this, not check item, but to toggle checked. I think it makes more sense because that's what it does, right? We don't only set it to true, but we can also set it to false. And as you can see right now, it gave us an error, toggle checked, which is really nice. And here we want to, we actually toggle checked. We can also rename this and then toggle checked. Now we're gonna keep the checked items in a state. So when should we toggle? So when checked is true, the item will be marked as checked in the database. So it should only be checked as marked in the database when the state doesn't contain any checked items that are, because those are already checked. So if it's in there, it should be toggled off. If it's not in the already checked items, it should be toggled on. So we can just use the JSSum method, call it item, and then what the hell? Call it, what am I, Jesus Christ. Item, and then item.id is equal to the ID of the component we are rendering. Still giving us an error. There we go. Okay, so if there's a checked item in there, then we toggle it off. And if it's not checked already, then we will toggle it on. Now, how do we initialize the checked items? Well, we do that by using the toggle check method. So if this item is already checked, then we will uncheck it. And if it's not already checked, then we'll check it. So if the checked items, where we keep track of all the items that are, striked through, if that array contains, if any of those array values contains the ID of the item that we just created, then we're gonna set the check, we're gonna remove that from the state. And if it doesn't, then we're gonna add it to the state. Let me just comment that in really quick. Remove it from the checked items and add it to the checked items. Okay, that is what we are doing. Now, when this item is checked, right, we want something to happen. And for that something to happen, I got my cheat sheet open here on the left side because there is some CSS involved in this and I'm not the best at CSS. So we want this span to be wrapped in a relative div, and I'll show you why in a second. And the reason is that we can absolutely position a div, a certain special div in here. And as you can see, it's a motion div. What is a motion div? It is a special, from framer dash motion, which is a dependency we haven't installed yet. So the motion div with framer motion is a package that allows you to add some animations to your projects. Now, framer motion is not the smallest animation framework, so I would be careful using too many of them, but if you do it sometimes, that's totally fine, I think. And yeah, so if the checked items, if the item we're rendering right here in the map is already in the checked items, then it's going to be strike through, and if not, then it's not going to be strike through, and that works perfectly. So let us add something like a piece, not something longer, like a window cleaner, and if we strike it through, then it's going to be strike through. Now if we reload the page, then that should keep the current state. So let's add one more, like onion. And when we have the onion and reload the page, then they don't get strike through. Okay, so they don't keep that state, which is not ideal. And why is that red, by the way? I don't know. Okay. well, anyways, so, okay, why is it not strike through? Let's just comment this out for a second. Let's set it to true. So whenever we click the span, then this right here should happen, but we'll also console log that we clicked it just for debugging purposes, then toggle check to true. And we'll also log the ID just to see which ID we change it to true for. So let's click on the apple, go into the console, remove that, apple. Okay, so the ID is something with 00 at the end. It should be true now. Let's reload. And that is true, so that worked. Okay. Now let's implement this and see if that is the problem. Let's save that. Now it should be going back to false, right? So let's reload that. And it's not going back to false. Okay, so the problem is in this statement right here. The checked items.sum, and yeah, that should not be checked items, but that should much rather be the items we are initializing, because the checked items is not initialized in the same way. So the checked items is only a local state we're keeping. So if we save that and then remove everything, let's click on the apple again. Now that should have changed, and it didn't change. Okay, so then this statement is still the problem. The items do contain, and that makes no sense at all, because items will always contain the item we are currently rendering. So this statement makes no sense. Let's see if the suggestion from GitHub Copilot works. Reload the page. Now it's false, and now it's true, and now it should be false. Now it's false again. Okay, so the problem was, let's see what the problem was. I'm not too sure actually. Checked items.sum. Okay, let's copy that and then paste it here. Comment it out. Okay, so checked items.sum item ID. If that is the case, so if it's already checked, then it should be checked false. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes total sense. So, okay, right now we're saying if it's already in there, then this will evaluate to true. And if this is true, then you know it's gonna be checked again, pretty much. And if it's false, then it's gonna be unchecked again, which doesn't really make sense. So that's why the suggestion from GitHub Copilot came in really helpful, came in really handy here. Let's just keep it like that. And now we are pretty much done with this project. So we have an apple, window cleaner, and onion. We can strike them through, reload the page, and they are still not through. Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay, and they're still not strike through whenever we reload. Why is that the case? Let's go back to the localhost 5555. Okay, so two are checked, but they're not checked here. Okay, so that is a problem we can fix. Animate checked items dot we can checked items. The solution would be to initialize the checked items. And so if we got the items, then we will set the normal items to everything we get here. Let's call them shopping items. Just a bit more verbose. And we also want to set the checked items. Const checked is equal to shopping items dot map. And we only want every item that is checked. And then we can set checked items to checked. Nope, that doesn't work. We can just use filter. And that works. Okay. So we're only putting the ones in state that are checked. Now they are strike through. I can undo that, reload the page. None of them are going to be strike through. But if we do it now, and now reload the page, then they should. Nice. Okay. Very, very good. So we can strike them through whenever we bought the product or whatever. Then add another item. Let's call it video lighting. Add that. We bought that, so we can strike it through. And then whenever, you know, we want to remove a product, we can also do that by clicking the X. And that will remove the product from our database right here. And if we add one more, and you can see in real time pretty much the camera is added to our database. That is a great beginner full stack project. Now, I'm not gonna deploy this project right now because one, I think, you know, you have probably deployed a lot of projects already and know how to do it. If you don't, feel free to just leave a comment and I will gladly make a video on how to deploy on Vercel. And you know, it would be a bit risky because there's no authentication or cookies or anything for this app. So everybody could do whatever they want with it. And that is kind of a security risk. So I really hope you enjoyed the video, found it useful, and I wish you a lot of fun applying this knowledge to your own future projects and really expand on the knowledge that you hopefully learned from the video. Have a good one and bye bye.